Hi, thanks for coming to this edition of Mac Talks. I appreciate McMurray College giving us the opportunity to share our area of interest and expertise with you as instructors. As you can see, I'm living through shelter at home with my laundry machines in the background. My name is Chris Strangeman. I have been teaching at McMurray College since 2012. I am an associate professor of history, and I earned my PhD in modern European intellectual history. Along those lines, one of the things that I find fascinating, which I think we're living through now, is how events and ideas shape the world and the way in which we think about the world. I'm certain that, 10 years, a generation from now, there will be historians that are saying lots and lots of fascinating things about the times that we are living in now. I'd like to give a shout out to my dad, who died about 2 months ago. He didn't die from the coronavirus, but I want to give the shout out because he shared his love of history with me and kind of this notion of how times that we live in can be so fascinating. And along those lines, I would like you to ask to turn back with me about 100 years, a century or more, to 1914. And World War I starts in 1914. The United States fully enters the war in 1917, and the war ends in 1918. It is one of the watersheds of European history. It was longer, lasted longer, and was far more devastating in terms of loss of lives than many people gave it the idea that it would be when it started. And what we finally have were these industrialized countries with science and technology that were turning those technologies and that industry upon destroying one another. And World War I was so profound that historians looking back say that after 1918, what we've done is we've entered into the age of anxiety and uncertainty. It was so profound that events that were happening at the same time have oftentimes been overlooked by historians. And one of the events that has been overlooked by historians is actually called the forgotten pandemic. That is the influenza pandemic of 1918, which is the worst pandemic of modern times and probably the worst of world history outside of the Black Death of the 14th century, nearly 700 years ago. And what I would like to do with the time that I have with you is to kind of give some history of the influenza pandemic of 1918, lasted into 1919, and how it has relevance and parallels for the times that we are living through now with the coronavirus pandemic. So, if we were to turn back, what we could do is we could see that there were 3 phases of this influenza pandemic. The first one starts in the spring of 1918. And people are not exactly sure where this starts, but the first documented kind of evidence-based case that we have of that flu actually was on an army base in Kansas that served about 54,000 soldiers. And you have to keep in mind, the United States enters the war in 1917, but it's not until March and April of 1918 that they start sending really large numbers of men overseas. And this makes the pandemic much worse than it could have been otherwise, because you have so many more people coming into contact and intermingling with people that they would not have had contact with otherwise. There's also some argument that the pandemic could have started in a British staging area and hospital that was in northern France that was site to a piggery, and lots of poultry, lots of birds being brought in. And if that's the case, it was similar to now the coronavirus pandemic that we have, in the sense that it might have started with the spillover event, where viruses that had been living in animal hosts are actually find human hosts. There is evidence that the pandemic of 1918 has very distant connections to the virus that caused the swine flu of 2009. And it's also similar to what happened to start the coronavirus pandemic, and then it started in a Wuhan wildlife wet market where a virus from an animal was able to spread over to a human host. So the first wave starts March, April, spring 1918. Americans are going overseas, and so they interact with lots of other belligerent powers The allies include Italy, France, and Britain. What's important is to keep in mind that all of those powers were interested in this war effort and making sure that everything they could do was going to this war effort. So they had censorship of the press. So when people started talking about this influenza, it did not get into the press. The place where it did was in Spain, because they were not a wartime power. They were not fighting during World War I, and so they weren't censoring their press. And so this is why this flu pandemic took on the name of the Spanish flu. It was also called the Spanish Lady. In fact, the monarch of Spain at the time actually contracted the virus. He suffered through the flu. Another thing to keep in mind is that when this also started making big waves and big circles and becoming more and more kind of widespread, a lot of the Allied powers actually said that it was because of German biological warfare that they were using upon the Allied powers. So the first wave goes and it hits, and so kind of it goes down again. What happens, it gets to the summer. And in retrospect, a lot of people say that the summer kind of went away because it got to these higher temperatures. And again, this is relevant to today, and that lots of people are hoping, and from what I understand, this is not probably a very good hope, is that higher temperatures were going to make the kind of coronavirus kind of go away, if you will. So it goes down. What happens during this time is the virus actually kind of mutates, and it takes on a much stronger stance. Then we hit to fall. In fall, it takes off again with this mutated strand of the virus, and it is incredible. This second phase is the worst part of the influenza pandemic. It is so bad that October of 1918, 195,000 Americans die because of the flu. That is the deadliest month in American history. More people died in October of 1918 than all of the American soldiers that fought in World War I. There were about 116,000 lives that were lost of American soldiers in World War I. October 1918 loses more than that. And one of the things that happens that is so terrible with this kind of second wave is that typically the flu has a U-shaped kind of curve. So that people on one side that are under 5 years old, that do not have kind of fully developed bodies, fully developed immune systems, suffer high mortality rates. People that are older, that have weaker immune systems, suffer high mortality rates. But people that are relatively healthy in the middle are the bottom of this U. That's not what happens with the pandemic. What happens with the pandemic is a W shape, right? So these people in the middle, about 20 years old to 40 years old, that are relatively healthy, have fully developed immune systems, don't have an effective way to fight this off. Because it has taken on this mutation, right, it becomes much stronger. And so when it attacks the human body, those people that are healthier, kind of stronger immune systems, their immune systems ramp up. They take on the virus, but then they turn on themselves. And this becomes an incredibly nasty kind of version of the flu to have, right? So I'll just give you some signs, but it could kill within 24 hours of the first signs of infection. You have blistering fevers, nasal hemorrhaging, pneumonia. You drown in your own fluid-filled lungs that have mucus and blood in them. Within hours, people's faces turn dark blue and purple due to oxygen in their blood, and they would bleed from their noses and their ears. This was awful. And you have to keep in mind at this point in time, some of the advances that we have now that can help us at least try to fight off this virus they didn't have. They couldn't even see under a microscope that the flu was caused by a virus. At the time, they thought it was actually caused by bacteria, right? There is no flu vaccine until the late 1930s. There are no ventilators until really the late 1920s, and not widespread until the 1950s, really with the fighting against polio. They didn't have these kind of advances. And so one of the things the doctors did and they turned to is they said, okay, so take aspirin. You know, it's not going to fight it, but at least it can maybe help alleviate the symptoms of it. But what we found out later is that they were recommending up to 30 grams of aspirin a day. And we know now that anything over 4 grams of aspirin is unsafe. They just didn't have effective ways to fight this, right? So what happens is they turn to social distancing methods in much the same way that we are turning to social distancing methods now. And so I'll just read some of these off, which are going to sound, sure, very familiar. Isolation, quarantine, good personal hygiene, use of disinfectants, limitations of public gatherings, closing schools, closing places of public amusement like pool halls and theaters. But they were applied unevenly. And this is the same fear that we're having now. Those people that react much faster tended to fare much better against this, whereas people that were slow didn't fare nearly as well. You also had lots of issues. So, for instance, one, we didn't have enough physicians and nurses for healthcare kind of on the domestic front, in the sense that a lot of them have been shipped for kind of medical reasons, right? That they needed kind of those for the soldiers. There were issues of quarantine by governments because they were interested in making sure that they had enough people to work munitions factories and other factories for the war effort. The war itself also became really, really dangerous for this, in the sense that when people got sick on the front lines, instead of being isolated, they basically went to hospitals, military hospitals, where there were lots of people in very small areas, and so this started to run through them too. Right? Probably the worst case example of people ignoring social distancing methods at this point in time was a public health director in Philadelphia. There was a Liberty Loan that was coming up, parade that was coming up in September, late September of 1918, and he was like, look, I don't want to close this off. I'm interested in holding this parade because it's going to raise millions of dollars for the war effort. Infectious disease experts from around the country tell this guy, please stop. We don't want this. This is not a good idea. And he's like, I'm not going to do it. 200,000 people approximately go to that parade. Within a week of when the parade was held, all of the hospitals in Philadelphia are full. Philadelphia becomes something that literally is almost out of the Middle Ages. There are people with open carts driving around, yelling out to others, bring out your dead. Basically meaning that there are people that had died in their family. They're supposed to bring their bodies and put them in these open carts, which they would then drive to these mass unmarked graves that would then be kind of bulldozed over or steam shoveled over later on with dirt. Right? It's just awful. On the other hand, St. Louis provides a very good example of social distancing methods working during that second phase. The director of public health was really interested in making sure that he got out in front of these things. And so when there was an outbreak at a military barracks that was really close to St. Louis, they had already been proactive. And so they don't suffer nearly as badly as what other places do that don't put these social distancing methods into effect. Right? So the second wave is awful. Kind of goes away a little bit. It kind of mitigates itself. This mutated virus strand kind of weakens, and then we hit a third phase. And this was winter of 1918 and spring of 1919. And it was bad, like the second wave, except for the fact that because the world had essentially been exposed to this, we finally had herd immunity. So there's finally kind of some immunity to fight this off, which is, again, is exactly what we're hoping for now, that the people that actually had to suffer through the effects of the coronavirus and COVID-19 have a built-in immunity. And we're not exactly sure if that's true or not at this point in time. And I'll conclude here by giving you some numbers. So, in the United States, the life expectancy dropped from 1917, before the flu, to 1918 when it hit its peak. In 1917, the life expectancy for females was 54 years, and for men it was 48 years. In 1918, that had dropped 12 years, so that the life expectancy for women was 42 years, for men was 36. In the United States, 675,000 people of 106 million total population die from this, which is just over 6% of the population. It is estimated that globally, 1 out of every 4 people actually had come in contact with this virus, right? And of 1.9 billion people, somewhere from 50 to 100 million people, more than all the people that were civilians and military of World War I had died, right? And so again, this is fascinating, kind of interesting stuff that has a lot of relevance for our own time. And I thank you for kind of staying with me. I'm going to sign off now, but please, if you have questions, sign into the kind of forum and ask them, and we'll be checking that just in case, so that I can respond to those. But thanks for sharing the time with me.